I'd like to spend the next few minutes talking to you about Artemisia Gentileschi, the female Baroque artist who painted biblical scenes and used them to empower women. She was born in July of 1593 in Rome, Italy. So Artemisia was named after the Greek goddess Artemis, who, as you may know, asked her father Zeus to wear a short chiton like the boys had. And she wanted this so she could more easily run and hunt. She also asked her father never to make her get married. So the goddess Artemis kind of bucked the system, and coincidentally, Artemisia ended up doing the same thing. Artemisia's mother died when she was 12 years old. Her father was a painter, and so she kind of became his assistant when she was very young after her mother died. So pulling away from her directly for a moment, let me give you some historical context. So she was born in the late 1500s, and this is just as the Italian Renaissance was coming to an end and the Baroque period was beginning. So I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence by assuming you don't know, but this isn't art history, it's seminary. So I'll give some framework just for a few seconds. Renaissance art is known for realism, and it's got a really strong emphasis on humanism. The human form is really important to Renaissance art. Baroque art is characterized by its drama. So it's intended to evoke really strong emotions as opposed to the realism of the Renaissance. And it also very frequently depicts movement. So as an example, take these two sculptures of David. Michelangelo's sculpture depicts David preparing for battle, and the human form is exact and it's realistic. Bernini is a Baroque artist, and his sculpture shows movement and emotion. David is in the act of throwing the stone, and this drama is a characteristic of Baroque art. Interestingly, Baroque art was brought about in part because of our friend Martin Luther and Protestantism. So early Protestants were generally opposed to art adorning churches, and paintings and stained glass windows and the like were frequently destroyed. In response to this, the Catholic Church went even further in the opposite direction and began to adorn churches even further. And the Baroque period was largely started by the Catholic Church in response to the Protestant Reformation. I mentioned that Artemisia was trained by her father, Artemisia Gentileschi. He was a contemporary of another artist named Caravaggio, and Artemisia became a follower of his as well. In fact, she was the only female follower that Caravaggio ever had. Artemisia's earliest work is a painting of Susanna and the elders, and this is a story in chapter 12 in the book of Daniel, but it's not in our Protestant Bible. And since we're a room full of Protestant seminarians, here's the quick Spark Notes version if you don't happen to be familiar with the story. Susanna is a beautiful, virtuous, and godly woman who is married to a wealthy man. Two older, respected men in the community, they serve as judges, which they call elders, become infatuated with her. And one day they secretly spy on her while she's bathing in her garden, and then they try to blackmail her. They tell her that unless she sleeps with them, they will accuse her of adultery with a young man. Susanna refuses this, and she chooses to preserve her relationship with God and preserve her honor instead. The elders do falsely accuse her of a crime, and she's brought to trial, and she just protests about her innocence, but the crowd is ready to condemn her and execute her. And then the young prophet Daniel, remember I said this was in the book of Daniel, he was present at the trial and he speaks up. So Daniel cross-examines the elders and he speaks to them separately and asks about the details of their accusation. So specifically, he asks them where they saw Susanna and the young man. And the accounts of the two elders contradict each other, and it's clear that they're lying. So as a result of this, they're exposed as false witnesses and they are executed, which was the punishment that Susanna was to receive. And Susanna is saved and her innocence is proven. This story is a frequent theme for artists during the Renaissance and Baroque periods, and a few paintings of Susanna by different artists in the same time have been scrolling as I told the story. Take a look again at Susanna in these, and notice the contrast between the depiction of her by male artists in the sample and in Susanna's posture in Artemisia's painting. Susanna is much more forceful here than in some of the other examples. The men have painted Susanna as meek, as demure, as shrinking, and in at least one example, as sensual. In Artemisia's painting, by contrast, her hands are positioned warding off the elders. She appears to have more fight in her and more grit to her than the Susanna of the other works. She's a stronger character. And this is going to be a hallmark of Artemisia's work for years to come. Strong women are the focus of most of her portfolio, and this began really early on for her. She painted this in 1610, and I'm not sure if you were doing the math, but she was only 17 when she completed this painting. That same year, when she was 17, Artemisia's father, Orazio, worked on a fresco with an artist named Agostino Tassi, and her father asked Tassi to train Artemisia. One day during the training, Tassi raped Artemisia. Her chaperone was there and did nothing to stop it. Tassi promised Orazio that he would marry Artemisia, but he reneged on this, and it's then that Orazio pressed charges against Tassi for raping his daughter and refusing to marry her, which brought shame on the family. The trial lasted for more than 8 months, and during Artemisia's testimony, she was tortured with thumb screws to ensure that she was telling the truth and not trying to soil a reputable artist's name. The transcripts of this still exist, and we can read about her attack in her own words. Tassi was sentenced, but one of his patrons was the Vatican, and his relationship with Pope Paul V helped ensure that he never served any of his sentence. Artemisia was a lifelong Catholic, and as she watched the church protect her rapist, she reached a turning point. I mentioned earlier that she lived during the Baroque period. The Catholic Church was a major patron of art at that time. Artists were commissioned by the church to create works that conveyed religious narratives and moral lessons. She was young and female in the early 1700s, but she used her art and she played in the church's world. And while doing so, she used biblical themes to show women's power. Artemisia goes to Florence and becomes the first woman to become a member of the Academy of Art in Florence. And there, she becomes friends with this guy named Galileo. While in Florence, Artemisia paints her most famous work, Judith slaying Holofernes. This story is also found in the Catholic Bible. It's apocryphal for us, so like before, I will show a few artists' interpretations of it while I summarize the story quickly. The Israelites were under threat from the Assyrian Empire. Holofernes, an Assyrian general, had Judith's city under siege. They'd cut off the water supply and the city was near surrendering. Judith is a young widow. The story describes her as wise, strong in her faith, determined, and beautiful. Judith prays to God for guidance, and then she makes a plan. She dresses in her finest clothes, and she puts on makeup. And then she leaves the city with her maidservant and goes to Holofernes' camp. Judith is young, and she's beautiful, and Holofernes invites her into his private tent. Then he gets drunk, and he passes out. And Judith and her maidservant steal Holofernes' sword, and they sever his head with it. They put his head in a bag, and they walk out of the Assyrian camp with it. They show it to the Israelites, who rally and launch a counterattack that defeats the Assyrians. This story is a subject of dozens of works of art, most of which show the women presenting Holofernes' head to the Israelites when they've gone back to their own camp. But Artemisia does something bolder. Remember earlier when I said that her father was friends with Caravaggio? Here's a depiction of the same story that he painted. It's an action shot, which, if you'll remember, is a characteristic of the Baroque period. Artemisia takes a leaf out of his book, but Judith and the maidservant are even more powerful. Look at the way Judith has a fistful of Holofernes' hair and beard. You can see from the crease in her wrist that she's pushing down on him. And the maidservant, who's shown as old in many of the paintings, is as young and as strong as Judith, and she's pushing down on Holofernes with all her weight. Look at his fist next to her head. He's much larger and stronger than the women, but together they're more powerful. While in Florence, she befriended Galileo, and he had been studying the physics of fluid dynamics and projectile motion. And he'd made discoveries on the arc that blood forms when it spurts out of a wound. He and Artemisia obviously have discussed this, and we can see it from the violent arcs of blood coming from the wound in Holofernes' throat. The face of Holofernes, that's Agnestina Tassi, her rapist. And Artemisia paints herself as Judith. Artemisia painted about 60 works during her career, and of those, more than 40 of them feature women as the primary subject. While she was not in ministry, the dramatic and emotionally charged nature of her paintings serve as visual sermons. They convey religious stories and moral lessons in a manner that was accessible and impactful to those that saw them. And speaking of those who saw her work, her patrons included Florence's Medici family. Her work both supported the Catholic Church's effort during the Counter-Reformation and at the same time challenged traditional gender roles heralded by the Church. I am no Artemisia Gentileschi expert, but while her work continues to scroll, I'll be happy to answer any questions that I can and look up anything that you may want to know.